to the NDU INSS website, and you'll find it there as well. So, grand strategy, I think, is a very interesting topic for a couple of reasons. You may be aware that in our doctrine, in our American military doctrine, we don't really use the term grand strategy. Our government tends not to use the term grand strategy, preferring national security strategy, national defense strategy, national military strategy, and so on. But grand strategy has prominence certainly in the academic community, and I think for those of us who focus in the field of security studies, it's certainly a topic that we ought to think about and we ought to talk about, because I think it's valid and it's useful. So maybe the first thing we ought to talk about is what we think grand strategy is. What's a good working definition of grand strategy? And just about everybody that's written on it has a somewhat different definition. So I'm going to offer you mine, and then maybe in the Q&A you can tell me what you think about that. But before I do that, I'll give you just a flavor of the discussion. So Colin Gray calls grand strategy the purposeful employment of all instruments of power available to a security community. Robert Art excludes all the non-military instruments of power from grand strategy. Christopher Lane says that grand strategy is simply the process by which the state matches ends and means in the pursuit of security. Sir Hugh Strawn sees grand strategy as more forward-looking, aspirational, and maybe because he's a Brit, oriented on preventing or managing great power decline. My personal favorite is Ed Lookback, so get a load of this. Grand strategy may be seen as a confluence of the military interactions that flow up and down by level, with the varied external relations that form strategy's horizontal dimension at its highest level. And if you can figure out what that means, you're a better man than I am. Okay?
Eddie's usually clearer than that.
Personally, I consider myself a practitioner. I've spent most of my career either having strategy inflicted upon me, teaching it in the classroom, writing about it, or hopefully trying to practice it in different assignments in the chairman's office and in the White House and so on. And for me, simplicity has a virtue all its own. So I see grand strategy, I would propose we define grand strategy as very simply the use of power to secure the state. And I'll explain what I mean by that. First, I think grand strategy exists at a level above particular strategies that are intended to secure particular ends, and above the use of military power alone to achieve political objectives. So there are also a ton of definitions of the word strategy, but generally the term is used, as Michael Howard uses it, to mean the use of the military instrument to secure political objectives. Okay? So that's how I look at grand strategy. I think one way to comprehend grand strategy is to look for long-term state behavior as defined by enduring core security interests and how the state secures and advances those over time. So in a way, this means that what the state says is less important than what the state does. Grand strategy is therefore related to, but it's not synonymous with national security strategies, national military strategies, quadrennial defense reviews, defense strategic guidance, and so on. Grand strategy transcends, in my humble opinion, the security pronouncements of political parties or of individual administrations. So viewed in this light, American grand strategy, I argue, shows great persistence over time. It orients on those things that are deemed most important, those interests for which virtually any administration, whether it's Jimmy Carter or Bush 43, will spend, legislate, threaten, or fight to defend. So a little bit of scene setting for where we are right now. At the end of well over a decade of counterinsurgency, the U.S. finds itself repeating a familiar historical pattern. So financial retrenchment that accompanies the end of every conflict, exacerbated by the economic collapse of 2008 and the Budget Control Act of 2011. We see ground forces being drawn down pretty precipitously. The other services less affected. Most U.S. ground and air forces have been repositioned to the continental United States. And under current legislation anyway, defense spending will decline over the next 10 years or so by approximately 10% per year. We'll see if that holds up. At the same time, emerging non-traditional threats, cyber, WMD wielded by non-state actors, international terrorism, and so on, are now crowding the security agenda. And increasingly other threats, such as narco-trafficking, illegal immigration, environmental degradation, demography, youth bulges, organized crime, and even climate change, are also cast as national security threats. So I'll have more to say about that later. So what does this all portend for American grand strategy? First point I'd like to make is that I think it's important not to confuse enduring core strategic interests with others that aren't. So the most recent QDR describes the security environment as rapidly changing, volatile, unpredictable, and in some cases more threatening. And certainly, I suppose, there's an element of truth in that. And yet, addressing this environment, this current security environment, in fact aligns very comfortably with American grand strategy over time. Broadly speaking, our vital or our core interests are remarkably consistent. So they are the defense of American territory and that of our allies, protecting American citizens at home and abroad, supporting and defending our constitutional values and our forms of government, and promoting and securing the U.S. economy and standard of living. Virtually every strategic dynamic and dimension is encompassed in those four. The grand strategy is by no means confined to our military forces and institutions, but is far broader, encompassing all forms of national power. Now, having said that, I would caution against trying to define everything in terms of national security. Any discussion of grand strategy very quickly loses coherence and utility when we do. What do I mean by that? As a young White House fellow at the very beginning of the Clinton administration, I was assigned to the NSC Defense Office, and I started keeping a list of all the good ideas that political appointees thought the military should be used to try to address or to try to fix. I think my list grew to 27 by the end of my year. My favorite was retasking military satellites to track the rate of erosion of the rainforest in the Amazon River Basin. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing to do. I would question whether that's an appropriate use of very scarce and very expensive military resources. Another example would be the suggestion to put the military into inner city high schools to try to grow JROTC programs all over the nation. That's another example. All initiatives by well-meaning people who see the resources of the Department of Defense, its people, its budget, etc., as ways to go after pressing problems that I would argue fall outside the domain of traditional national security concerns. If we're not very careful, we're going to find those resources dispersed in a harmful way. So any assessment, I think, must begin with looking first at the security environment and then at threats to our core or vital interests, and I use those basically interchangeably, without, on the one hand, overestimating them, and on the other hand, undervaluing them. I think the international security environment by now is very well understood, and it's very familiar. So the bipolar, traditionally Westphalian state system of the Cold War has given way to a more multipolar system, which features a militarily and economically dominant, preponderant, but not all-powerful U.S., a rising China and India, a Russia which is in some ways resurgent, an economically potent but militarily declining Europe, an unstable and violence-prone Middle East, which is racked by the Sunni-Shia divide and the Arab-Israeli problem, a proliferation of weak and failed states, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, and the Russian periphery, and empowered international and non-governmental organizations and non-state actors. Terrorist organizations and international organized crime are far more significant than formerly because they're enabled by global communications and information flows. But in absolute terms, and this is important I think, in absolute terms, the world is a lot safer than it was 50 years ago. The prospect of nuclear, mutually assured destruction and world war costing millions of lives right now seems something that's relegated to the past. Even so, most societies feel threatened and insecure, while conflict, even if it is much more low level, remains endemic. Now, the broad threats which face us have deep roots, but they've also evolved over time. And in order of importance, I would suggest that they can be summarized as first, the use of weapons of mass destruction against the homeland. That's a pretty broad category. So it encompasses everything from sort of a strategic nuclear exchange right up to the use of a WMD by a non-state actor. And by the way, a WMD can be something which is not chemical, biological, or nuclear. I mean, you can fashion a very powerful, very kinetic, conventional WMD that can cause horrific damage. And we've seen that in a couple of cases. Economic disruption from without. So the crash of 2008 was largely self-induced, but the health and the stability of the U.S. economy can also be affected by the actions of foreign powers. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which jeopardized the international economic order by threatening free flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, is one example. A major cyber attack against the financial sector, or the closure of the Straits of Tiran, or the Straits of Malacca by a hostile power, could be another. Any major disruption to the global economy, which depends upon investor confidence as much as the free flow of goods and energy, can have catastrophic consequences for the U.S. And American presidents have repeatedly shown a willingness to use force to ensure access to markets, free trade, and economic stability. Third, the rise of a hostile peer competitor. For several centuries, Great Britain aligned against the rise of any power that was able to dominate the European landmass and upset the balance of power. And the United States did the same in opposing Germany in World War I, Germany and Japan in World War II, and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The U.S. rebounds to Asia, and opposition to Chinese territorial moves in the East and South China Seas can be seen as an attempt to counter the rise of China in a manner which is consistent with long-standing U.S. grand strategy. A peaceful, non-hostile peer nation or grouping of nations, such as the European Union, poses no strategic threat to the United States. An authoritarian great power, possessed of both military and economic means and an apparent desire to enlarge and expand them, could in time pose a direct and even existential threat to American national security. And American grand strategy has traditionally opposed such powers and would in all likelihood do so again. And finally, direct challenges to key allies. So we are engaged in various forms of partnerships and alliances with something like 60 nations in the world. Alliances like NATO and bilateral security arrangements with close allies such as South Korea and Japan constitute solemn commitments that extend American power and influence globally. Cooperation with allies adds their military forces to ours and secures forward basing and other rights that we need to secure U.S. interests around the world. We do not enter into them altruistically, but because they serve U.S. interests. To preserve international stability and to deter conflict, these arrangements have to be honored and respected. Failure to do so in one case, such as an attack on Japan or South Korea, would call into question our commitment to all such commitments and compromise, perhaps fatally, our system of alliances and treaties worldwide. And this is why U.S. leaders can be expected to act decisively when close allies are directly threatened. Now, there, of course, are other threats that are of concern to national security practitioners that fall below this threshold. So an attack on a U.S. embassy, the kidnapping of U.S. citizens abroad, or the pirating of U.S. flagged vessels on the high seas are examples. U.S. leaders might also contemplate the use of military force under the evolving doctrine of responsibility to protect, or R2P, as we did in the case of Somalia in 1991 and Libya in 2011, or when our national pride has been touched, as in the Mayaguez and the Pueblo incidents. However, these by definition do not engage grand strategic objectives, and statesmen assume risk when they treat them as they do, primarily because strong and sustained public support is less assured. In the same way, promoting democracy and human rights abroad are often touted as national security or foreign policy imperatives. Very interesting that the 2014 QDR lists democracy and human rights, maybe for the first time ever, as a core vital interest. It'd be interesting to see if that makes its way into the national security strategy, which will be published
In our lifetime, I think.
sometime. I don't know when. I don't know.
It's a year late.
Now, while this is consistent with American political culture and our ideology, in practice, these tend to be very highly case-specific. So when they're consonant with the framework and the principles of U.S. grand strategy, the U.S. may act, but just as often a pragmatic realism governs. I'd suggest maybe Sudan as an example. The long nightmare in Syria and its attendant spillover in Iraq, with its tragic loss of life, accelerating regional instability, mounting extremism and terrorist involvement, and massive human rights violations on all sides, would seem to be a classic case calling for military intervention. And yet there's no UN or NATO mandate. There's no strong reservoir of public support for military action. There's no appetite for intervention among our allies and partners. And there's no desire to dispute the agendas of Russia, China, and Iran in Syria, at least for the time being. And so with no direct threat to the homeland, U.S. citizens or allies, or the U.S. economy, the prospects for large-scale military intervention at present seem low, despite the humanitarian tragedy that is unfolding. The crisis in Ukraine presents a different case study. While the prospect of committing U.S. forces to defend Ukraine following the seizure of Crimea is low, Russia's direct challenge to the post-war security architecture in the Euro-Russian space, which was so carefully constructed for over a generation, has been completely thrown over. The North Atlantic Council voted to defer NATO membership to Georgia and Ukraine, and did not station NATO troops in the new member states, largely out of deference to Russian security concerns. These confidence-building measures notwithstanding, Russia sent troops into Georgia in 2008, where they remain today, and in particular the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, under which Ukraine agreed to surrender its nuclear weapons in exchange for Russian guarantees of its territorial integrity, have been seriously compromised, along with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and apparently the NATO-Russian Council. Large Russian forces, having seized Crimea, are now massed on the eastern and southern borders of Ukraine, and indeed in some cases are operating inside Ukraine. The concerns by NATO members, especially the newer ones located in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, are mounting as Russian leaders assert the right to protect ethnic Russian minorities in neighboring countries. This scenario presents a different challenge to American grand strategy. But should Russia seize more Ukrainian territory, NATO's Baltic members could very possibly come under threat. And this is an altogether different matter. Russian subversion or military action in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia may be deterred by NATO's Article 5 guarantee. And U.S. leaders and their allied and partner counterparts will work hard to dissuade any thought of further aggression through energetic diplomacy and severe economic sanctions. Still, should Russia reprise its Crimea land grab in the Baltic states, it's more likely than not that the U.S. will respond militarily under the Washington Treaty and encourage its NATO allies to do the same. Direct confrontation with Russia, which is still a major nuclear and conventional power, may seem unthinkable. Yet failure to honor our treaty obligations to NATO would mean the virtual collapse not only of the alliance, but also of our security relationships around the world. And such a loss of global reach and influence would negate U.S. grand strategy altogether. For that reason, however much against our will, I believe the U.S. would in all likelihood confront Russia should a NATO member be attacked or directly threatened. So a few words about the means of grand strategy. We just talked about the ends. I would argue that the means of grand strategy are similarly enduring over time. So what are they? Fostering strong alliances and bilateral security arrangements, maintaining a strong and survivable nuclear deterrent, fielding balanced, powerful, and capable military forces, dominant in each warfighting domain, that can project and sustain military power globally and prevail in armed conflict, and providing intelligence services that can ensure global situational awareness and provide strategic early warning. These are the basic components. These are the means of grand strategy. And as we can clearly see, they've been in place over many decades. There's nothing new about them. They are intrinsically linked to a powerful economy and industrial base, advanced technology, an extensive military reserve component, an educated and technically skilled population which is fit for military service, and a political system which is based on classically liberal democratic values, and we would hope able to make clear and sustainable policy and resource decisions. Now, in some important ways, these tools and these capabilities are or are perceived to be eroding. The U.S. economy, which is still the largest in the world, has not fully recovered from the 2008 crisis. Mounting alarm over deficits, record deficits, and an inability to control spending resulted in the 2011 Budget Control Act, which was approved against all expectations and mandated the cut that I referred to earlier, triggering sequestration and then a succession of budget crises. So confidence in America's economic and fiscal future has been a bit shaken. America's traditional reliance on forward presence and forward deployed forces, which is another strategic linchpin, has also declined since the end of the Cold War. Few combat forces remain in Europe. The last tank was removed in 2012. Only a single ground combat brigade is based in Korea, and there are no ground combat troops which are permanently based in the Middle East. Naval forward presence has also been scaled back in the post-Cold War era as the size of the fleet has come down. On the alliance front, relations with our NATO allies have been damaged by the perception or the reality of the rebalance to Asia, which was widely seen as a devaluation of Europe on the part of U.S. leaders. I was in NATO at the time and sort of lived through that. By Secretary Gates' very stern speech in June of 2011 when he castigated European allies for failing to meet targets for defense spending. President Obama's leading from behind stance in Libya, the pullout from Iraq, the pending withdrawal from Afghanistan, and inaction in Syria are interpreted by some as evidence of a disinclination to engage globally in the interest of international stability, although others see these as more prudent and measured restraint. So while U.S. determination to act forcefully in support of the international order may be more open to question, and while U.S. economic and military power may not be as dominant as formerly, in absolute terms, the United States remains by far, the preponderant power in the world. Possessed of great actual and potential strengths in hard power, the United States is unequaled. Even so, coherent and effective political direction is the essential precondition to strategic success. Since the end of the Vietnam War, mounting conflict between the legislative and executive branches, which is exacerbated by a fractious polarization of American politics, has reached alarming proportions. Repeated wars have led to a concentration of the war power in the executive branch, arguably resulting in more frequent uses of force that may not command public support. Unquestionably, a healthy and stable set of political arrangements that provides for effective sharing of power while ensuring popular backing is essential. And when these are lacking, I would argue successful strategic execution is at risk. Now let's close up with a few words about the ways of grand strategy. I would say how the U.S. addresses direct threats to its core or vital interest over time is the essence of grand strategy. And typically our solutions are not new, although the technologies that we employ may be. The first principle is to meet the threat as far from the homeland as possible. And thus, since the end of the Second World War, we've established bases, positioned forces, and stockpiled weapons and munitions around the globe. Buttressed by economic and development assistance, formal treaties, coalitions of the willing, and alliances. And we can also see counterproliferation in this light. America's network of overseas bases, airfields, and alliances, as well as forward deployed air and naval forces, is still quite extensive. America's ability to project power globally and sustain its forces virtually indefinitely remains unmatched. U.S. satellites survey the globe and monitor adversary communications continuously. And though smaller than during the Cold War, the U.S. strategic nuclear arsenal is survivable, redundant, and accurate, providing an absolute nuclear deterrent against any adversary. Next, the U.S. prefers to meet serious threats using different tools at once. In theory, reserving military force for last and relying on intelligence, diplomacy, forward presence, and its economic power to forestall or deflect or defuse security challenges. Still, U.S. military power is awesome. I brought a little fact sheet here just to kind of make this point, because I constantly hear around this town that the sky is falling and that if we don't buy the B-3 or we don't buy the Gerald Ford or the Zumwalt class destroyer, or whatever the case may be, we're really in the hurt locker. Just a few facts. The U.S. lead in sea power. The U.S. Navy operates 11 large aircraft carriers, all nuclear powered. I think maybe we're down to 10 now. No other country has even one. The U.S. has 57 nuclear-powered attack and cruise missile submarines, more than the rest of the world combined. 79 Aegis-equipped surface warships carry roughly 8,000 vertical launch missile cells. This outmatches the next 20 largest navies. I think almost all of those are allies, with the exception of just a few. All told, the displacement of the U.S. battle fleet exceeds the next 13 navies of the world combined. Let's look at air power. The U.S. fighter and bomber inventory in all services totals 2,643, which is a crushing superiority over China, with barely more than 1,000, many of which are older models, and Russia with about 1,400, again, many of which are older models. And both of these countries would likely fight without allies. Ready reserves add another 720 combat aircraft to the U.S. total. The United States Marine Corps alone is larger than the armies and the air forces of all but a handful of nations in the world, okay? I think it's important to recognize where we are. I was at a CFR event last night with Admiral Harry Harris, who is soon to take over PACOM, and he was asked the question about the perception of America in decline, America as a security provider in decline. And I would just suggest that there's another side to that story. You hear it often. I suggest there's another side to that story. So our military strength across the warfighting domains, which is supported by this unmatched ability to project and sustain military forces very far from the homeland, remains far, far ahead of the rest of the world. Wherever possible, the U.S. prefers to address threats in tandem with allies, partners, and like-minded states, working through international organizations like the UN or NATO, and conducting pre-conflict engagement and shaping operations on a large scale. Yet when vital interests are engaged, the U.S. will act unilaterally if necessary. Preemption to disrupt or prevent imminent threats falls well within America's grand strategic calculus. prevention, the use of force to deter or defeat threats before they become imminent has, I would argue, on the other hand, a far less prominence. And we saw that, I think, in the Bush 43 administration. So, in summing up, as the preponderant global power, the U.S. attempts to shape the international security environment to try to prevent or ward off security challenges whenever it can. When not, and when significant or vital interests are engaged, military force often comes into play. Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has used military force many times, with varying success, to protect, secure, or advance its security interests. Now, when military force was used, I think this is the best part of the presentation, so pay attention here. It's good stuff. When military force was used, the record of success or failure is illustrative when viewed in the light of the grand strategic framework that I just tried to describe to you. So in the previous century, we've experienced clear success when the threats to vital interests were unambiguous, when the response enjoyed strong support from the public and from the Congress, when overwhelming force was applied, when strong allies participated, and when the strategic objective was well understood. Both world wars, the Cold War and the Gulf War, are examples. In cases where the direct threat to U.S. interests was less clear, overwhelming force was not applied, public and congressional support was not strong or sustained, and the strategic objective was unclear, defeat or stalemate ensued. Korea, Vietnam, Beirut, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan are, of course, the relevant examples here. In some cases, like the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Panama, Haiti, Kosovo, these considerations that I just mentioned didn't fully apply, but weak opposition and overmatching force led to early success, which forestalled the loss of public support or the stagnation of the conflict. Now, I think these historical lessons are compelling, and I think they deserve close study. American political leaders have not always recognized them, and they have certainly not always applied them. And their apparent jettisoning by both Republican and Democratic administrations since the Gulf War has come with a heavy price. America's successes in war and in deterring war have resulted at least as much from an industrial and a technological superiority employed en masse by competent military institutions as from any other factor. This superiority is best translated into battlefield and campaign success by synergistically applying air, space, sea, cyber, and land power in time and space to achieve decisive objectives that see through and beyond the end of combat operations. One service or one-dimensional applications of force have repeatedly failed of their promise to deliver strategic victory. So what's the way ahead? As we assess a complex security environment, our historical experience provides useful and helpful context and guideposts to understanding the present, even when security threats are harder to define and address, as in the case, for example, of cyber attacks. Conversely, much of the prevailing academic discussion distracts or frustrates practitioners. One leading theorist offered presidents a choice from among strategies of neo-isolationism, selective engagement, cooperative security, primacy, or enlargement and engagement. Another proposes strategic restraint, offshore balancing, forward partnering, selective engagement, or assertive interventionism as strategic alternatives. Others argue for regional priorities, Asia Pacific or the Middle East or Europe, or threat-based priorities, W&D, cyber, counterinsurgency, or for capabilities-based strategies, for example, the maritime strategy of the 1980s. And each approach offers useful perspectives. But true grand strategy looks beyond these choices, orienting on American strengths and American interests to address the global challenges of the moment in a larger framework of diplomacy, economic strength, military power, and global leadership. Presidents don't really have the choice to embrace isolationism, to ignore alliances, to eschew engagement, or to neglect important regions of the world. The current administration may highlight the rebalance to Asia as its priority, but potential conflict in the Arabian Gulf, another WMD attack on the homeland, or Russian military action in the Baltic states, as just a few examples, will immediately become the pressing, consuming challenge, and it will remain a critical priority until it's resolved. So taking the long view and acknowledging the strong impact of new technologies and threats, I believe the framework of American grand strategy as described here will remain relevant and current for decades to come. The international security environment will remain anarchic and uncertain, with the state mattering more than supranational organizations, even as non-state actors of many kinds proliferate. Conflict will remain endemic, and state-on-state conflict will recur. WMD attacks against the homeland will be attempted, and some may be successful. Pressures to intervene in the Middle East, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, and perhaps even in East Asia will persist or will surface anew. Strategic shocks, unanticipated crises requiring strategic responses will be more the norm than not. None of this is new, unique, or even more dangerous than in the past. So strategists must accordingly consider and refine the ways and means by which our traditional enduring security interests may best be defended. Along the way, I think a certain humility is helpful. As Kissinger wrote, the gods are offended by hubris. They resent the presumption that events can be totally predicted and managed. At its very best, grand strategy is fundamentally not, or not always, about fighting, about the military application of force, but rather an appreciation of its potential along with the other instruments of power in the mind of the adversary. President Reagan's role in bringing about an end to the Cold War, I think, is a classic example. In this sense, effective grand strategy may often preclude the need to resort to force. To achieve this, the involvement of society in its own national defense, a strong, stable, and globally networked economy, and effective domestic politics that can make rational resource decisions over time in support of national security, and the promotion of values that invite support and consensus at home and abroad will count for much. So too, balanced and capable military forces that are sized and able to operate globally and in concert with civilian counterparts, international organizations, allies, and partners. The decision when and if to use force should never be approached casually, emotionally, or half-heartedly, but rather soberly, analytically, and with the whole of government and a whole of society intention to prevail. There should never be doubt that when core interests are engaged, the U.S. will bring the full weight of its power to bear and will persist until success is achieved. And on these foundations, I believe, will rest an effective U.S. grand strategy far, far into the future. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions and comments. Who's first up?
Well, Rich, I'll take the first question there, since
To break the ice.
warm up here. I thought in your monograph you did a great job starting out our history, revolution, and how we've evolved, and you closed with some historical examples, 20th century. But could you perhaps give us your opinion on really two things? How has our political culture, as it's evolved since our founding, and our founding documents, influenced our thinking in grand strategy? And tied with that, going back to our Constitution, the decision to declare war, which has rarely been, never been used in this century, and rarely in the 20th century. And how do you think that has impacted us positively or negatively in our pursuit and execution of grand strategy?
Yeah, well, certainly if you look at our views about national security very early in our history, they were colored by an understanding and appreciation that we sort of existed on the margins of the great powers, and that it was really not in our best interest to try to engage or confront them. So for the entire 19th century, what we tried as best we could was to stay out of European, conflicts, the Napoleonic Wars. We kind of got dragged in the War of 1812 to some extent into them, but on the whole, we did a pretty good job. And we tried to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. And I think we had good success in achieving that. For much of our history, the presidency was not nearly as powerful as is the case today. How did that change? Well, it began to change in the administration of Andrew Jackson. It for sure changed in the administration of Abraham Lincoln for obvious reasons. Wars, and in particular big wars, have a way of doing this. Obviously, the First World War and far and away the Second World War saw a growth in the power of the executive branch and a concentration of the war power, which continued to evolve probably because of the advent of nuclear weapons and the need to be able to respond immediately all through the Cold War. So the president's ability to use force more or less unilaterally has been held up in any number of court cases. And this is why the War Powers Resolution is called the War Powers Resolution and not the War Powers Act usually, because if it were ever to go to court and face a challenge, the odds are good that the war power would be upheld in favor of the executive branch and not in favor of the Congress. Now, having said all of that, and with the due appreciation for the need in the modern world for the executive to be able to respond promptly to a direct threat, I believe that the migration of the war power from the legislative branch to the executive branch has not been healthy, has not been a good thing for our society and for our culture and for our constitutional system. And you can lay a goodly portion, I think, of the blame on the Congress, because from one point of view, the Congress does have an absolute and immediate ability to constrain the president's use of the war power just through the appropriations process. It's hard to do things if you don't have any money to do them. I think probably 100 years ago, politicians were at least as aware and sensitive of their status as members of the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate as they were of their party affiliation. I could be wrong about that, but that's the way that I see it. It seems to me now that in most cases it's more important to be faithful to your party and to your party's agenda than it is to be faithful to the prerogatives of your political institution, the U.S. Congress, the House, the Senate. And I think it's a shame. I really do. I do think that we fight too much. If you talk to our friends in Europe and other places around the world, they'll tell you that to your face. We're always at war. I don't think the military tries to push us into war, but it seems like we're always fighting. That's not healthy for a society. It's not. I don't have a roadmap or a prescription to get us back to where we need to be or where we ought to be. Maybe it's going to take some major kind of cataclysmic event, I don't know. But I think that a dangerous concentration of power in any part of our government goes against the constitutional vision of the framers. Probably not a healthy thing. But I'm interested in hearing what you all might think about that. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming, first of all. Just want to circle back to this, the public support being very critical in sort of the whole process of brand strategy. And obviously, the press has a big role in that. So can you talk about sort of the PR things that the government needs to be doing that it isn't doing right now to sort of get public support behind these efforts?
It's certainly true that the president has a role to play as opinion leader. And the president does have a bully pulpit. And I think part of the art of governance is to lead the public in the direction that the president may feel is what's best for the nation, right? But I think part of the art of governance is also knowing what your what your constituency, what your polity thinks, understands, feels, and wants. And this is changeable. So I think what I see over the last generation has been a tendency for us to engage in these sort of no-win, no-lose conflicts. So I think you can see Korea in that light, you can see Vietnam in that light, you can see Iraq in that light, and you can see Afghanistan in that light. Now, why is that? Well, I mean, if you take the entire nation to war, you better be damn sure that you've got the strong support of the American public, right? If you're not sure that you have that level of support, or you're not sure that you can sustain that level of support, then you probably don't want to take the whole nation to war. It doesn't mean that you don't want to do stuff. So we find ourselves getting involved with a certain set of political objectives, a certain level of military force, a certain level of funding, and we find that it's not satisfying. The advisory effort in Vietnam is failing, as one example. So what do? Many of you, I suspect, will at some point in your careers be practitioners, so I hope you'll try to keep this in mind. Presidents don't find it easy to back up and say, you know what, this didn't work very well, we're just going to quit. It's not the way it works. They're going to try to keep going at least until the end of their administration, or at least until after the end of the next election, rather than say, let's cut our losses and let's kind of retrench. We gave it a good effort with advisors and with air power and with financial assistance to our ally, but it's just not working out. We've got more important strategic priorities to pay attention to in the central region in Europe, which is where the real threat is. We're just going to call it a day in Southeast Asia. It typically doesn't work that way. So the big question, the big decision, I think the big thought process probably ought to be up front, where you're taking the decision to use force. Because if you've read your Clausewitz, what you know is that when you start killing people, when you start shooting bullets, it becomes about survival, right? It becomes about the survival of the soldiers on the battlefield, but it becomes about the survival of the presidents and the premiers who are making these decisions. And you know what? The struggle for survival is inherently impatient with what? Limits. So the tendency is to escalate. We're going to surge. We're going to send in the big units. We're going to bomb the north, right? But we're not going to take the whole nation to war. We're not going to activate all the reserves. We're not going to re-invoke conscription. We're not going to do those things. So now what you've done is you've poured a lot of gasoline on the fire, and I'm making a very complicated phenomenon kind of simple, I know that. You poured a lot of gasoline on the fire now, but you haven't committed yourself with all of your resources and all of your society to prevail. That's why I believe that armed conflict ought to be rare, and if you're going to engage in armed conflict, you ought to be serious about it. Be serious about it. Maybe not a great answer. What does the media do with all of this? The media has an irreplaceable role in shining a spotlight on what's going on. Does it have its own agenda? Does it have its own political coloration? Is it interested in capturing the attention of viewers? Yeah, it's got all of those things. It's got all of those things. Some of them are very frustrating and some of them are not very helpful. But I would never want to live in a society that didn't have a free and open and aggressive press, because the American people deserve to know what the hell's going on. And the government will not always make that available to them left to its own devices, for reasons which it thinks are good reasons. Sir.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Nathan Slaughter. I'm a graduate student here in the SSB. I had two questions for you. I apologize.
That's fine.
The first goes back to your hard power assessment that you gave us, which I thought was very useful and accurate in its bluntness. But the 2030 Global Trends report forecasts equivalent U.S.-China military expenditures by 2030. That's only 15 years away. And so in terms of military planning, development, adoption, and construction of advanced military tech, read Joint Strike Fighter, this is a relatively small window. So it might be reasonable to say that while the sky is not falling, it may be lowering at an alarming rate with respect to China. The second question revolves around the way you kind of read the history of success in military use and what leads to success and what leads to not so much success. And that I'd like to bring in the example of Al-Qaeda, where we have not been successful despite the fact that the goal was clearly defined. We had strong political support as well as popular support. Articles written by Dr. David Gardner-Ross as well as Dr. Hoffman in thorough analysis have shown this to be true, arguing that they have witnessed broader membership, geographical location, and control of territory since 9/11. So in this question, I'd like to ask, do you believe this example posits that there's a significant shift or change in the way 21st century conflict is executed in our relationship to that form of conflict?
Yeah, I'm either a conventional or traditional or Luddite observer, depending upon your point of view on all of that. I would like to caution you all against this phenomenon of which is sometimes called political science newism or presentism. Everything that we're seeing right now is new for the first time because we're here and we're wrestling with it and we're awesome and we're cool and we're living in a world that has never existed before. It's just not true. Insurgents have been around for a long time. Terrorists have been around for a long time. The globalization of the world economy is something that's actually been going on for centuries. It's not something that's new. Now the rate of change is changing. No doubt about that. No doubt about that. The American public was seized with the terrorist threat after 9/11. The American public has not been seized with the need to achieve clear-cut success in the Middle East, which is where most of the international terrorism seems to be localized right now, not all, but most, for a long time. Al-Qaeda is a persistent and continuing threat, and I would say violent religious extremism, because there are other organizations besides Al-Qaeda, ISIL, which is sort of a successor organization. But that doesn't mean that it poses the direct threat to the homeland that it otherwise could. Now, I'm worried about ISIL controlling territory and being well-financed and having the ability now or soon to mount a dangerous attack on the homeland, right? And I might approach the problem of ISIL or ISIS a little bit differently than the administration is doing right now. But I also think it ought to be kept in its proper perspective. And so, frankly, should the rise of China. So you cited a couple of people who say the global trends are really bad, and in 2030 we're going to all be in trouble. And if a couple of political scientists said that, I guess it must be true. I'm just saying, you know, let's take a deep breath. Let's look at the possibility or the probability that Chinese economic growth is going to continue unchecked for 20 years. Okay? It's not very likely. Why is that? Well, as the standard of living rises in China, wages rise in China, and people are going to stop going to China because their labor costs are better than everybody else's. The world is going to change a little bit. I hope the Chinese do build aircraft carriers and they do build surface warships. I hope they do, because they'll spend billions to do it, and in the event of a conflict with the U.S. Navy, they will be sunk. If we're smart enough not to sail within range of the mainland. But being the Americans and wanting to buy lots of stuff, we have air-sea battles, so if those guys get their way, that's exactly what we'll do. But if we're intelligent and smart about it, I think we'll be just fine. I'm a lot more worried about the proliferation of nuclear weapons in states which are kind of chronically unstable. I'm a lot more worried about that because it's just uncharted territory. It's certainly true that nuclear powers have heretofore, I think I'm correct in this, have not really gone to war with each other, or at least not gone to war with each other in a big way. We're still trying to figure out, what does it mean when Iran has a handful of nuclear weapons, or what does it mean if North Korea has a handful of nuclear weapons? We had a very interesting session last month at INSS with General Mike Scaparrotti, who's the USFA commander in Korea. And we said, you know, in the event of a conflict with North Korea, let's assume for the sake of the discussion that your campaign plan, your war plan is successful. And he says, I'd like to think it will be. And we said, okay, so as you're experiencing campaign success, don't you think that the chances of the North Koreans' use of chemical or biological or nuclear weapons goes up and up and up? Because the regime probably can't survive losing war. And he said, yeah, that's a good point that you guys raise, right? So I didn't really get into it into my newspaper in my presentation, but it's probably relevant to what we're seeing. Let's say the example of the crisis going on in Ukraine right now. A big part of this game, and it's a game for grown-ups, and it's a game that requires a lot of thoughtful people playing it. You got to give the other guy a way to back down. The world that we live in is so dangerous right now that this sort of absolute, definition of victory is something that most of the time probably is not going to come into play. The last thing in the world we want is a showdown with Russia. We want to be sure that in the event of a confrontation, triggered, let's say, by the economic collapse that's going on in Russia today because of the fall in oil prices, the economic sanctions, and kind of the collapse of the ruble, it kind of puts Putin in a difficult position because he can improve matters by stepping back and saying, okay, I'm going to stop my mischief in Ukraine, and in exchange I'd really appreciate it if you guys lifted economic sanctions and we can all go back to being friends. He may make that decision. It's just as likely Putin won't make that decision because for lots of reasons his hold on power would probably suffer because it would be seen in his inner circle as being defeated or showed up by the West. So there's also a possibility that he will double down and up the ante. And in a confrontation like that, many of you probably read Henry Kissinger's recent op-ed on Ukraine, which is terrific. I mean, everybody wins when everybody's willing to come to the table and give something up, right? It's a dangerous world, and the absolute last thing you want to do is get into a shooting confrontation with a great power if there's another way out of it. I'm also less worried about the rise of China than some are, for a very interesting reason. I sat through a lecture when I was at the NATO Defense College in Rome by a very elderly demographer from Germany, who said, I'll tell you why I'm not worried about China. I'm worried about China because the average household in China is one child. You lose one son in a war, and the family's wiped out. So he put up a slide of 62 conflicts, and he said, what does every single one of these conflicts have in common? It was the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, on and on and on and on and on, including many you never heard of. And he said, what they all have in common is excess or surplus military-age males in a society on the side that began the war. Now, we don't teach that in IR programs. I have to confess that it never really occurred to me that way. I'm not 100% sure that guy's right, but I think
Eddie Lookback
probably
wrote
onto
that about
something.
10 years ago.
He's probably onto something. And those societies change over time. So today, unlike 1914, the birth rate in European societies is very, very low for kind of clear reasons, right? Well, the Europeans don't seem to be very inclined, towards military action. And that's probably one of the reasons why it is. Yes, sir.
When you were discussing the means, you mentioned intelligence. I had a question about, do you think that the United States way of formulating intelligence needs to be more strategic as opposed to tactical? And how do you think that will play into us implementing our grand strategy?
I'm tempted to say it's hopeless. I mean, the list of intelligence failures, that we've sustained it's as long as your arm. You just go back and again and again and again. I mean, we didn't see the Germans putting together 26 divisions to do the Battle of the Bulge. We didn't really see Pearl Harbor. We really didn't see Saddam invading Kuwait. Most of the time we don't see these things coming. So what I tell students is, listen, if you think as a strategist or a practitioner that you're going to be able to predict these, what I call strategic shocks in my presentation, you're going to be disappointed. So just get used to it. Be ready for it. The intelligence system, the intelligence community, if it's operating well, I mean, it can give us understanding and awareness of what's going on in the world that we live in. but we're probably going to be disappointed if we expect it to predict for us in a timely way really bad things that are going to happen. I mean, maybe they will on occasion, but most of the time they won't. It's not that they're not good people or smart people or competent people. I think that's just the nature of the game. There's no international relations theory that says, and then Napoleon gets born, or Adolf Hitler gets born. It's a messy world that we live in. And our job is to try to be as ready as we can to meet unanticipated things. And that's why I think it's so important that we be broad-based and we be flexible. So I believe it would be a huge mistake for us to be overly preponderant in air and naval power, but have inadequate ground forces. Or for us to forget that our economic power is the essence of our military power. Or to forget that this society's got to participate in its own defense. It's got to support what you're doing, or you're going to have a big problem. This is what I mean about being holistic. Another very kind of interesting phenomenon, and I'm pretty sure it's not very healthy, is that we can probably get involved in a big war with about 5 people really being involved in the decision process. So who took us to war in in 2002 and 2003? Any president would have gone to war in Afghanistan. Iraq was a very different thing. Congress really didn't play much of a role in that. Look, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, let's be honest, really didn't play much of a role in that. It was about 5 people. I don't think that's the way a democracy is supposed to function, Nor do I think the threat was so direct and so imminent that we just had to act right now and invade Iraq. And I mean, I'm not a registered Democrat, guys. I'm just calling it the way I see it. We've got a system that was put in place for good reason, and we ought to reflect on that. I think it's a dangerous thing when a very small group of people, particularly if they seem to be ideologically motivated, have the power to just commit us all to a venture which, by some accounts, is going to cost us in the end $2 to $3 trillion, and not tens but hundreds of thousands of lives. That's a pretty big responsibility. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thank you again for coming. I just had a question. So in the presentation, you mentioned the importance of our allies having confidence that we would follow up on our obligations. And I was wondering, I had a question about broadening that a bit about American prestige as a possible national interest in general. More recently, I remember specifically that after the red line was drawn in Syria, that there were some commentators and other political thinkers who were saying that we lost a lot of face, because we didn't follow up on that after it was crossed. And I was wondering, do you think that's actually significant? Is it actually national interest, or is it kind of a tertiary interest instead?
Yeah. Well, I think confidence in the strength of an American commitment is important. So that suggests that it's a good thing for presidents to be very careful about drawing red lines. So we've said for a generation that we would not allow North Korea to develop nuclear weapons. We have said in the same way that we will not allow Iran to field nuclear weapons. We said that we would not allow Assad to use chemical weapons against his own people. So I forget what the movie is, but there's a great line in the movie about the hard part about playing chicken is, knowing when to duck, when to flinch. Better be careful about putting things out there if you're not determined to follow up on them. Why? Because when you find yourself in that situation, then the next time you want to draw a line, your credibility is going to be, diminished a bit. Now, was this a fatal thing? No. I think most allies and most adversaries know that when you touch on America's core vital interests, regardless of the administration in power, you're going to see a response is probably going to be a powerful response. This was not a vital interest, right? It was sort of a below the line kind of a thing. Important for lots of reasons, but not a core or a vital interest. So, and then of course the media is going to make a lot out of it because it's a good story and all of that. Do our close allies think that if the Iranians close the Straits of Tehran, we're not going to be there? We're not going to do anything about it? I'm pretty sure they don't think that. That would be my answer to it.
Richard, let me ask you.
There's one more down here.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that your approach to the current ISIS conflict would be different than what the administration is currently undertaking. Would you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah. My analysis is that the only way that you can go after ISIL and have effects, be successful, is to get the Sunni in the field against them. Why is that? You could conceivably build up the Peshmerga and put them on steroids. They could overrun Mosul, and then we could reverse the tide of events, and we could eventually eject ISIL first from Iraq and then go to work on Syria. Except that those lands aren't Kurdish lands. So you just lay the seeds for another generation of warfare. In the same way, the administration seems to be set upon trying to build back up the Iraqi army. So we're doing everything through the government in Baghdad, right? Well, the Iraqi army is predominantly Shia. And the last thing that the Shia militias want, that the Shia political parties want, and that Iran wants, is to build up a powerful Sunni ground force, which after it's finished dealing with ISIL might turn on Baghdad, right? So those efforts to build up Sunni National Guard brigades and to run all the money through Baghdad and to run all the equipment through Baghdad, they're pretty anemic. Why? Because it's really not what the Abadi government wants. Or even if Abadi himself wants to do that, he's not able to do that. And even if it was successful, which I don't think it could be, those are not Shia lands. If the Shia army tries to overrun Anbar or Mosul or Tikrit, you're right back to square one, which is this ferocious confessional warfare that we've seen kind of since we blew up the Iraqi state in 2003. So the challenge is to get the Sunni in the field, and you have to be aware that you may have to, this is not going to be congruent necessarily with Iran's interests or even with Baghdad's interests to do that. So I think that there's a need for sort of a plan B and even a plan C to do that. We have to decide in our own mind what our most important strategic priority with respect to ISIS is right now. If it's to preserve the unity of the Iraqi state, or if it's to continue to insist that Assad must go in Syria at the same time that we're insisting that ISIS must be defeated in Syria, well, those aren't congruent policy aims. So, a smart guy once said, the smart guy was actually me, who said, the worst sin of the statesman is self-delusion. Mistaking the policy wish for the policy reality it's a big mistake. You got to be really careful about that, right? Now, if we think that ISIS or ISIL poses a direct threat to the homeland, then that suggests a pretty powerful response. And that suggests that you got to educate the American public to just how serious that threat is. I think the administration doesn't see that yet, or right now, because if they did, I couldn't explain our campaign. So I think with the best intentions in the world, we're hoping that we can get the Iranians on board and get the Abadi government on board and try to get everybody to see things the way that we see things, and I hope it works out that way. But I think it's probably unlikely right now. Not an easy problem though, very, very complicated, very complicated. And it raises the important point that as many people have noted, conflicts never really end. They never really end. So who would have thought in the 80s that all the work that we did to build up the Mujahideen to resist the Russians would have turned on us 15 years later and we would find ourselves fighting the same people? Who really saw the policies that we pursued in Iraq 10 years ago and even 5 years ago leading to where we find ourselves today? And I think the Kissinger quote about humility, it's really important. It's really important. You start down this road, you don't know where the road's going to lead. It's an awesome thing to make a decision to go to war. It's an awesome thing. You ought to really think once, twice, and 3 times about it. And I want to leave an insight with you, because I believe some of you are going to find yourself in these positions one day. I believe I saw this, on the E-ring in the Pentagon in 2001 and 2002. Power is exhilarating. It's intoxicating. And maybe you were there at the same time. I mean, you probably were. I mean, you could see it in the faces of these special assistants running around the Pentagon. It's almost like they were on crack, talking about putting people's heads on sticks. Squad leaders and fighter pilots typically don't talk like that, because they understand what the real game is about. Sometimes power is exhilarating for its own sake. Joe Powell used to keep a quote from Thucydides on his desk, which was that of all the attributes that people admire, self-restraint is the most important. So it's a sober business, and I hope people keep that in mind when you're running the country one day, which I'm sure some of you will be. So, but thanks for the question.
Are we nearing the end? I guess we are.
I can go as long as you want.
Yeah. Some of the sort of grand strategic constants that you refer to are really constants since World War II and the Cold War. And the Cold War was a unique set of circumstances. The one country that can threaten both ends of the Eurasian landmass does it. And we're there anyway from World War II, and so we stay. If you go back 100 years, then allies don't count, right? And we spent the first half of the 20th century avoiding allies. So,
nobody wanted us to be their allies because we weren't that important.
Well, but in World War II, I mean, Churchill wanted us to be an ally long before FDR could free up. I mean, thank you, Japan, for freeing up the American public on that issue. But so it seems to me, once the Cold War ended, what we've seen gradually emerge, and kind of deferred by 9/11 for sure, is a debate between two halves of the 20th century. There's the global engagement half, which really you're saying is a constant, but then you got guys like Walt and Posen and Mearsheimer and Andrew Bacevich up at BU, which wants to go back to the 1880s. Offshore balancing, meaning come home, or global engagement. And I think that's the debate we're starting to see. I mean, you and I probably agree on global engagement, but I don't think it's deeply rooted in the American public if we really take a long view of the Republic's history. And I worry that we're going to disengage on some of the things that you think are fairly powerful constants in the last 50 years.
So when I was in the doctoral program, they made me read all those guys. When I was in the NSC, you know what? People don't stay up late at night reading Mearsheimer or Richard Betts or Barry Posen, or they don't. They might read the occasional foreign affairs article because it's kind of short enough to read. And, they don't. I'm not worried about that because presidents don't have the option not to be globally engaged. The Secretary of the Treasury or the Secretary of Commerce or the Foreign Relations Committees or whoever, we don't have the option not to be globally engaged. It's always attractive to say we spend too much money on foreign aid, we spend too much money on overseas bases, let's just pay attention at home, let's build our society at home because our roads are falling apart. That's really not an option. I don't think that's really available to presidents and to senior political figures. Unless we just want to not be what we are. And we are what we are largely because we're globally engaged. I mean, we are kind of the lender of last resort. We're the economic balancer in the planet right now. The dollar is kind of the last refuge of, threatened currencies and all of that. And Great Britain used to play this role 100 years ago, but we've been playing for a long time right now. And it's really kind of hard to imagine a world where we don't do that. Now, is our interest in doing it to the degree that we used to do it previously as high? I don't know, maybe not. But I think it's a question of degree. It's not a question of ending that all together. It's just not it's not practical as far as I can see. Those of you who don't go into government but go off into academia will find yourselves motivated by the desire to write contrarian papers which will cause lots of interest. But the practitioners won't pay very much attention to you. I'll just throw that out gratuitously for you. It'll be interesting for a day or a week or a month, but and your peers, of course, will be very interested in arguing with you about them, but the practitioners won't pay much attention to it.
You know, if I may just disagree.
Okay. Okay.
Since we've now dismissed all those PhDs out there, you know, I agree. Presidential choices are starkly constrained, you know, today by yesterday and last year and maybe the last 30 or 40 years. But on the margins,
Yeah.
presidents, you know, make choices based on where they feel the American public is moving. And I think, I don't think this is just John Mearsheimer, although he probably thinks it's just, you know, there's a deeper debate going on here about just how much we want to be engaged in the world. And it relates to a deeper history than just the Cold War.
Yeah.
We're an island power that for 150 years sort of got away with it, you know, just staying out of the world and being this offshore, wait till the house burns down and then go in with a big hose and put out the fire in, you know, World War I and World War II. I think that resonates more than you think, and I think ultimately those things kind of make it to the White House. And it's not a, you know, it's not Obama wakes up and says, we're going to disengage. It's just on the margins, you know. Like, I'm not going to, having drawn a red line in Syria, I'm not going to support it, which I think was a huge mistake. But I'm not, because the American people aren't with me on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that was just his excuse. But I think those kinds of decisions start to be made on your sense of where the debate in the public is going.
Yeah.
And so you don't disengage tomorrow, but you know, maybe over 10 or 20 years.
Well, look, this is certainly what happened to the British Empire. I mean, they made a conscious decision to sort of divest themselves of their empire, partly, I think, because of the huge economic and demographic shocks that they suffered in the First and the Second World Wars, but also because of other reasons as well. And it relegated them to kind of second-rank status. And I mean, could that happen to the United States? Empirically, historically, I think you could say probably will at some point happen to the United States. But I think not anytime soon. Isolationism was a powerful political narrative and political point of view for a big part of our history. But I don't think so much since the Second World War. Even predating the advent of nuclear weapons, I think since because we truly moved onto the stage as a superpower when we demonstrated that we could defeat both Germany and Japan at the same time as the leader of a big coalition. And I've not seen an interest in us abandoning that role, and frankly, an interest in the part of many of the nations in the world in us abandoning that role, you know, since then. Will it happen someday? Yeah, I think it probably will. Nobody can stay on top forever. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Palmer. I'm in the program here. Thank you for coming today. What is your take on calls for the U.S. military to adopt or to adapt its military doctrine toward unconventional or hybrid or fourth generation warfare to kind of reflect this new security environment that we're currently facing? You alluded to it during your lecture, but
Yeah.
Bob planted this question last week, if you were.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you'll recall I expressed the view that it's not so new.
Yeah.
Well, the technology, you know, advances at a rapid rate, and we have to take that into account. My own view is that because you can't predict very well what your future challenges are going to be, it's in your interest to have a military force which is versatile and flexible, in all the important domains. So aerospace, land, maritime, cyber, but also is structured and sized and trained and equipped such that it can be good enough all up and down the spectrum of conflict. So I get nervous when I hear people say the era of state-on-state conflict is over. Dan Bolger wrote a famous article about 6 months before the Gulf War broke out, The Ghost of Omdurman, where he said, we have all these tank divisions in Europe, we'll never need them again, that era has passed. He was wrong. States will go to war with other states in the future, but you will also have many other kinds of conflicts at different places or gradients along that spectrum of conflict. And now there will never be a lack of people who are saying, as John Hagel used to like to argue, John Hagel, you know, in the 90s it was we need to have peacekeeping brigades, and then in the 2000s it was we need to have advise and assist brigades, and maybe if we had 100 divisions we could afford to have these specialized units, but we don't. We have a relatively limited ground force. But here's something I think you need to understand also. Military organizations are inherently, if you think about it, they're problem-solving organizations. So whether you're going to, you know, fight the Iraqi army in 1991, or whether you're told to go in and separate the Serbs and the Albanians in Kosovo and organize a town council and run this town. Let's say you're a captain. Well, those are very, very different things. But what you do have is a cadre of pretty intelligent, pretty well-trained leaders and a group of pretty disciplined, pretty great young soldiers or Marines, right? Who can figure it out. They can figure it out if you give them the right kind of preparation and the right kind of tools and the right kind of equipment. And I really think that's kind of the force that we have right now. Now we have specialist capabilities that exist in all the services. So we have EOD, and we have military police, and we have civil affairs. But the basic building blocks of our military, they're problem-solving organizations. And I think I come down on the side of, let's not try to optimize for coin, or let's not try to optimize for hybrid warfare. Let's optimize for the biggest, most dangerous threat, and have confidence that for lesser threats, as we always do whenever we find ourselves at war, we will adapt and we will come to terms with it and we will figure it out. I would hate to see a U.S. military fascinated with and optimized for coin, but I would also hate to see a U.S. military that throws all of that thinking and doctrine and lessons learned overboard because we didn't like it and we think we're never going to have to do it again. I think you just need to be ready to bring the 80% solution wherever the National Command Authority tells you to go employ it. That would be my approach. And this is why I hate one service solutions to national security problems. I hate them because the history is clear. They don't work very well. It's the synergistic application of all the instruments of power and all the different forms of military power that lead us to success. This is not what you want to hear if you're trying to sell the B-3 to somebody or you're trying to sell the Zumwalt to somebody, but I believe it's in the national security interest of the United States. We didn't get into too much about the kind of Iron Triangle phenomenon, but you all really need to be very, very, very aware of this. So we don't really, Powell was right, we don't really make strategy very well because our strategy process is corrupted by our budget process, which is corrupted by our acquisition process, which is often doesn't have a whole lot to do with, you know, what we think the threats are and what are the best ways to do that. So anybody know what a B-2 bomber costs? Anyone?
They took my course.
You could buy brand new tanks for the entire U.S. Army for the price of a single B-2 bomber. The entire United States Army. And I asked an Air Force general one time, how expensive would an airplane have to be too expensive?
45 billion?
Of course his answer was, well, it depends. You know?
We're about to find out with the
Yeah, we are.
long-range strike.
We are. And I wouldn't bet my pension that we're not going to buy the B-3, whatever that is.
Is that what they're calling it now, the B-3?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we will.
Oh, we'll buy it.
Not because
but not for $550 million a copy.
Not because it's the
even
best
close.
use of the taxpayers' money, but for other reasons that have to do with congressional politics and votes in districts and, you know, jobs after we retire and all those kinds of things, which you all are familiar with. So.
Look, I'm gonna call this to a formal end. It's 1:30. you have wisely or unwisely signaled that you have some more time. So if you want to engage Dr. Hooker one-on-one afterwards, feel free.
I'm happy
He's
to
offered
stay
his
for a while
time.
if any of you would like to
Yeah,
continue.
thanks for coming. Thanks for your good questions, and thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Hooker. for
Enjoy.
joining us.